Welcome back. Let's talk a little bit about what's happened in France and how it's dividing this entire world. How, again, one more time, a debate has been triggered over freedom of expression versus religion, religious sentiment. Now, viewers, as you all know, a teacher a few days ago in France was killed, beheaded, after the teacher referred to the Charlie Hebdo cartoons on Prophet Mohammed in class. Not just that, yesterday there was another attack where a knife-wielding terrorist targeted people in a church and killed 3 of them, cut their throats. Brutal killings, really. Now, the French president has taken a very clear stand on this, on what he calls the Islamist terrorism. The French president has also said that we will not be bowed down. We will stand for freedom of expression. And his view and the government and France's response to these series of incidents has completely divided the world. On one hand are the countries who are supporting President Macron, including our own. So let me first tell you what President Macron said, that we will not give in to terrorism. We won't give up cartoons or drawings. Fear is going to change sides. A very interesting comment that he made there, said Emmanuel Macron. Now, the countries who've backed him and France in this are India, United Kingdom, USA, Australia, leaders across the world who've come out and said, we stand with France, we condemn this attack, and nothing can really justify what's really happened in France and in multiple cities now. But on the other hand, many other nations, while condemning the attack, have taken a very strong position against the French government and its dealing of this entire issue. Most of them are fundamentalist or Islamic nations. Top of the line, of course, is Turkey and President Erdogan, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Saudi Arabia, while condemning the attack, said that we will not tolerate Prophet's insult. And the list goes on and on. So tonight, I thought let's have a larger global conversation about freedom of speech versus religion. And of course, it's not as simple as that. It's not just black and white. There is politics, there is economics, multiple geopolitical angles involved in this entire controversy and the big debate that's been triggered across the world. Let's say good evening to our panelists that we have tonight. Professor Harsh Pant, Director for Studies and Head of Strategic Studies Program at ORF. Pinak Chakravarty, former Secretary for Ministry of External Affairs. Abhijit Iyer Mitra, Senior Fellow for Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. And Nupur Tiwari, independent journalist and founder for smashboard.org, joining us this evening. Nupur, let's start with you. Not the first time that we've seen such polarized responses to a terror attack in France. Everybody remembers very clearly what happened during Charlie Hebdo's time. Give us a sense of, what is it doing to people in France right now? How are they viewing these developments?
I think that's a very important question to start this conversation with, because you see all the opposition that we're seeing from nations, about what's happening here in France, we are forgetting that the ground reality over here is very different. Remember that there have been absolutely no protests over here. There have been absolutely not even any statements made over here, because what we have to realize is that there is a false dichotomy and a polarization that is being defined over here, which we need to correct. So the opposition is not really between a kind of, extremist Muslim population versus secularism or freedom of speech. You have to understand that Charlie Hebdo, that is at the center of all this discussion, of all this violence, is actually, a publication that mocks or makes fun of or builds satire on a population in France which is basically made up of oppressed people. This is something that very few people outside of France or people who don't know France well enough understand. That most of the Muslims living here in France are actually very poor people. They are people who face systemic racism. In fact, if you are an Arab or black person coming from or with lineage from France's former colonies, your chances of being called for a job interview, for example, are 5 times lesser than anyone else. a woman who wears headscarf, educated as she might be, stands only 1% chance of being called for an interview. So basically what I'm trying to say is that this whole idea of freedom of expression and laïcité, which is the French concept of secularism, is really misunderstood by a lot of people around the world. I want to say this very clearly, that if you're looking at freedom of expression and secularism, you cannot see it in isolation with what is happening on the ground. Charlie Hebdo claims that it is freedom of expression, they should be able to make fun of religion. Yes, perhaps they should. But satire is, by definition, not something that works on oppressed people. You cannot make fun of the religion of people who are already under duress, who are people who are facing police violence every day, people who do not have jobs, who are the poorest in the country. And then there is this kind of militarized vocabulary that is being built. And what we need to see over here, that this is the political exploitation of what has been a gruesome murder, or let's say a series of gruesome murders that have taken place, to demonize an entire community. And remember that elections are only 18 months away, and Emmanuel Macron is a very, very unpopular president here in France. There have been tons of protests that have happened, which have been led not by Muslim people, not by Black and Arabs, but by the majority of white population. So this is the background within which you have to understand what is really happening. So in the name of secularism, in fact, a very silent, sidelined, oppressed community is being demonized. And this is something that Emmanuel Macron is going to use to sort of, push to please his right-wing voters. Remember that the last election that happened, Marine Le Pen of the far right was in opposition to Macron. So this is the context within which we should be having today's conversation.
Yes, in fact, just like perhaps what the Turkish president is doing and creating an entire bloc of nations that he is very enthusiastically now leading and campaigning against France, and using really unparliamentary language as well. But that is happened. Let me bring in Abhijit Iyer Mitra on the aspect that Nupur Tiwari raised. Abhijit, would you agree that in the name of freedom of speech or secularism, there is, a very subtle attempt being made to, again, target what is already an oppressed minority?
I'm sorry, Tanvi, but the three leaders who have gone on record and called for boycotts of Macron are not oppressed minorities. Erdogan leads a fascist government. I think we've all known what the population of Pakistan, the minority population of Pakistan was pre and post partition. And in Malaysia, you have a completely supremacist Bhumiputra policy. So let's not go there. Second, there is this very dangerous notion that if you are an oppressed population, you somehow get a free ticket, a free pass on free speech. I'm sorry, that's not the way it works. Let's look at this 10% of the population that comes from a North African origin. Tell me, why is it that the Jews, the Sikhs, the Hindus, the Vietnamese seem to have integrated into that population just fine, but 10% have not? You remember when France banned the use of the turban, the kripan, the 5Ks, well, some of the 5Ks at least, in schools, did you see Sikhs go on a rampage? They did not. So, these are completely spurious arguments. And I think any kind of taking this stand that somehow you can't poke fun at an oppressed minority is ridiculous. Free speech is just that. It is free.
But
you do what you
Abhijit,
want.
though, from my own understanding, and maybe Nupur can correct me if... Yeah, just 1 minute, though. From my understanding, and maybe Nupur can correct us, I think she was referring more to the response within France itself than about countries like Turkey or Malaysia or even Pakistan. Nupur?
I absolutely was, Tanvi, and I just have to say that Abhijit making these statements of saying that French Muslims are going on a rampage and they are not integrated. I don't know how much he knows France and how much he knows about French history and
I
the
didn't actually say
current
that, but anyway.
situation that people live in. Yes, the French Muslims are not going on a rampage. Number one, French Muslims have not asked Turkey or Erdogan to make these announcements. French Muslims are not integrated. French Muslims are not being given jobs. French Muslims are fighting back systemic police violence. People are dying of it. These are the things that people don't know about. French Muslims are not supporting these so-called murderers and beheaders. They are the first ones to come out and say that they are fighting against violence.
All right. Thanks. I just wanted that clarification. Abhijit, go ahead and finish your point before I go to our other two panelists, please. Yeah.
First of all, I did not say they are on a rampage. Second, I agreed with her they are not integrated. What I said is that all the other minorities seem to be integrated, but this 10% does not seem to be integrated. Thank you very much. I've lived in France I visit France quite often. I've lived in France for about a year and a half. I've been to all those banlieues and I've seen what happens out there. So thank you. But please do not misquote me. There is a very specific thing that if you are oppressed, it doesn't spare you from sarcasm. It doesn't spare you from being lampooned. It doesn't spare you from having cartoons made about your beliefs. That is the fundamental point of the
If you know what the meaning of satire is, Abhijit, the meaning of satire is that you call truth to power and you use satire as a tool in order to do that. That is not something that the French state needs to do against its Muslim citizens that are already living, a lot of them in squalor, who are completely marginalized and silenced. You do not make fun. That is not satire. You might have lived for 1.5 years in France. That's not enough.
Yes, okay, I take that point. But let me just come in here, Nupur, because I also have two other panelists to go to. So I'm just going to briefly intervene here and say that I also want to focus more about the fact on what's happened. Satire, justified or unjustified aside, right or wrong, ethically, aside, it still can't justify the violence, the brutal beheading. And that's unacceptable no matter what you write or what you say. That violence is unacceptable. And then to take it up and perhaps to, put it in a larger context, color an entire community or a religion or a faith is a different matter altogether. And that's what I want to talk about. Professor Pant, if I can bring you in here before going across to Pinak, Ranjan, Chakravarty. Is it as simple as saying freedom of speech versus religion, or is there more to what's unfolding right now?
Well, of course, there are multiple factors involved, and you have French politics, you have geopolitics, as you were talking about. Bijit was talking about different actors who are responding to this in a certain way because they have to respond to their domestic constituencies, and they are responding in a certain manner. But I think, as an academic and as a teacher, I also want to reemphasize the point that something, there is something fundamentally which has, I think, challenged a lot of people, is this idea that teachers can be beheaded because they are doing their job in a classroom. So I think the debate has moved beyond Charlie Hebdo, whatever Nupur might say here. The debate has moved beyond Charlie Hebdo. Charlie Hebdo was something that happened in the past. The consequences of Charlie Hebdo are being displayed every single day. France has been under this kind of a situation for the last several years now. So, especially if you look at the last few months, we have seen consistent attacks at a number of levels. So I think something is, there is a broader debate that perhaps needs to happen on this issue, and you can't do away with it because clearly the global, the larger global context is also evolving in a certain direction. So if Turkey deems it fit to use its credentials as a guarantor of the Islamic world, and therefore is privileged enough to talk about what is happening to Muslims in a certain way, then I think the Western world is equally when it responds in a certain way, then we should not take offense. So I think once we start looking at it from multiple points of view, given the geopolitics involved, we get different interpretations. But I think what is happening internally in France is something which is uniquely French. And of course, this is a problem that is also pan-European. It's not simply that France is having this debate. Of course, France's idea of secularism has been deeply rooted in a certain sense of its history and ideology. But there are also, you look at Britain, for example. The challenge is equally there. I mean, every few months you get a knife, a knife attack. Every few there's a bomb scare every few months. So there is a larger shift happening. Now, the reasons might be manifold. The reasons might be that there are constituencies within the country, within these countries that are now, raising their voices in a certain manner, and they are linking themselves up with a larger pan-Islamism movement. But whatever the reason be, I think that every nation will have this debate within its own historical, cultural context. France is no different. I think the Indian government has made a very nuanced taken a very nuanced position on this, which is very welcome. And I hope that we continue to stand by France in this very difficult hour, because the challenge is quite significant. It's not going to go away. And when we have such issues, we expect our friends to stand up to us. So clearly there is a larger challenge for India. There is a larger challenge for France. There is a larger challenge for the larger liberal world. And there is a larger challenge for the Islamic world to reconcile itself to it.
I just have a very small point to make over here, if I may, please.
Mr. Chakravarty, thank you for patiently waiting, and I'm so sorry to come to you so later in the conversation, but I wanted to know your view on is the stand that's been taken by President Macron really controversial or problematic for him to say that we will not bow down to this and we stand for freedom of expression? Is that a controversial stand or Islamophobic, as some are calling it?
Well, firstly, let me begin by saying that the whole issue has now been highly politicized. And whatever I am hearing that, oppressed communities are being targeted, etc., in France, etc. Oppressed communities are targeted everywhere. France is not unique in that. But that doesn't give them a right to go around and start beheading people. I do not think that right rests with anybody, and neither that their religion allows them to do so. And I was studying a little bit of the Quran. I speak Arabic, so I can study it. So I found that the Quran has nothing to say about this criticism. Nowhere in the Quran it says that if the Prophet is sort of critiqued or something, that you should go and behead somebody. This is a much later development of clerics and others in the Hadith and things like that. But this is becoming mainstream in the sense that it is happening in several places. It's happening in many Islamic countries. This is happening. It happens in South Asia, in Pakistan and Bangladesh. It happens in India, on the other way around, etc. So I don't think that this is unique to France in any way. Of course, the cartoons are unique because no other country does that. But it is the French way. They say that this is justified because we have freedom of expression. In India, for example, the freedom of expression, I think it's limited. I mean, there is a line that you don't cross, but freedom of expression can be interpreted in different ways in different countries. So what I'm trying to say is that it has become politicized and it has now got into the geopolitics of it, with Erdogan trying to lead the way to, claim some leadership, etc. But the point is that this kind of a violence cannot be sort of justified by anything, by any action of anybody's part. You cannot take the law in your own hands. By the way, the church attack in Nice, for example, was by a Tunisian, according to the reports that I have seen, who came into France just a month back. And he was, I think, living there. And suddenly, so did he come actually to commit this kind of an act that he gets up one morning and goes out to the church and slashes a few throats? So I don't know. I mean, these things are, there is something deeper happening here. That there are certain, I agree that marginalized communities, etc., oppressed communities, are more prone to this kind of violence because they think that that's the only way they can express themselves.
Yes.
But it can't be a general phenomena. I doubt if all the Muslims of France or French Muslims think that way. But there will be a few on the margins of that society or in any society who think like that, because some of that thinking is encouraged by the
yes,
clergy,
that's the point. I think that's the point. You can't color it to say it's just one religion and people from that religion who become a problem in every country. It's those who perhaps do get marginalized, who tend to pop up more in such kind of incidents. Frankly, it's a problem everywhere in the world. Maybe not a direct comparison, but look at our own country and what happens in our country. In our country, some people are so scared of offending people's religious sentiments that even before it becomes a big controversy, we change the stand. We go back on it. There's a movie that was just going to be released, which was labeled, titled Lakshmi Bomb. And a little bit of protest, somebody writing a letter has forced the producers to already change the movie's name to simply Lakshmi and not Lakshmi Bomb for the fear of hurting religious sentiments. It happens everywhere in different variations. I'm out of time, but yes, Nupur wanted to make a point. Nupur,
just
the last
one
word from you.
Yeah, thank you. Just one very important thing that I want to say is that there is no mainstream approval of terror in France from the Muslim community. There is no mainstream sort of extremist movement that's happening here. In fact, there were massive raids done in thousands of homes, shutting down of mosques that happened as a sort of white supremacy, white fury that happened, and only 0.17% of people could be charged with terror, and it's quite possible that they will have to be let go. So this is a completely false notion that the Muslims in France approve these beheadings. This is just a political exploitation of a very gruesome murder that has happened. The entirety of Muslim activists in France are constantly fighting against violence, against Islamophobia, which is entrenched in France, and against state impunity and police impunity. This is something that we have to understand because we are talking about French Muslims over here, and we are risking the lives of several million people who actually have nothing to do with what has happened in these attacks and who have condemned them.
Right. Thank you so much. I'm completely out of time. I'm going to thank all of our panelists, but it was an enriching and very interesting conversation I had with all of you. Fact of the matter is, viewers, what's happened right now as a series of isolated incidents, maybe not the first time in France, but definitely the way the world has become more polarized, more vocal about views, sometimes in some parts more intolerant, is beginning to come out. You are beginning to see the Islamic countries take a clearer position, come together to make this an issue about Muslims and Muslims being targeted. You are seeing politicians who are struggling in their own country, especially in France, to take up this issue and take a stand which would get them perhaps sympathy from the other side. I just have a very simple thing to say. It may be a very simplistic view, but sometimes that's what you need in life. No amount of justification can be given to a brutal beheading or slitting of throat or any kind of violence. No religion teaches such intolerance, and no one specific religion tops the list versus others. At the end of the day, it has to be about humanity and tolerance and nothing else. Unfortunately, economics and politics comes into the picture and then ruins everything else. Thank you so much for watching us and joining us in this conversation.